And here are the hallmarks, I think, of the pathological left. I think that if someone is pushing this quaternity on you, then you should be very suspicious of them in every possible way, and you should resist it as much as you possibly can. Diversity, inclusivity, well, you know, those are the minor demons of the radical left, let's say. Equity, it's like, no, we're not going there. That's equality of outcome, not equality of opportunity. And equality of outcome, I'll tell you why in a bit, is an absolutely pathological idea. There's nothing about it that's good. It's impossible to implement. It's fundamentally motivated by resentment. And it's a lie. So I like the fact that those three make the acronym DIE, though, because that seems to be approximately appropriate. So, and then the worst of the bunch is white privilege, because as far as I'm concerned, there's absolutely no difference between that statement and an outright racist slur. They're the same thing. So, and it's quite straightforward why. It doesn't take a bloody genius to figure this out. I mean, what constitutes racism? It's the ascription of the hypothetical qualities of a group to all the individuals who compose that group. So white privilege, it's like, even the people who are interested in intersectionality you'd think would have some problem with that. It's like, what about all the poor white people? Well, they're more privileged than the poor people who aren't white, I suppose, but you know, that's a pretty bloody weak argument in my estimation. And to call it privilege is also something, and to associate it with race per se is also something extraordinarily interesting, and we'll get into that a little bit. So let's talk about diversity. Okay, well, first of all, we have to define it. You know, and Jonathan Haidt has been trying to define it as diversity of opinion. I think it might be useful to define it as diversity of personality, because there's actually more variability in personality within groups of people, regardless of the groups, than there is between groups of people. So that should be said again. There's more variability within groups of people than between groups of people. And to state otherwise is to state something that is in fact categorically racist, because if I said, well, there's more difference between groups of people than within groups, then I'm saying that each racial group is an entity unto itself, which could be true but happens to actually not be. So the diversity definition is really quite interesting, and right now that's being defined by race, sex or gender, sexual orientation and disability, although there's a very large number of other potential dimensions of difference that could be included in the list of oppressed versus oppressor. That's actually why intersectionality has emerged, you know, because people figured out, well, you know, you're having a harder time if you're black, let's say, and you're having a harder time if you're a woman, depending on how you define harder time. But you're even having a harder time if you're a black woman. There's an intersection there. It's like, okay, fine. Well, where are we going to stop with the intersections? I figured out the other day, if each of those categories could be differentiated into 100 subunits, you know, who knows how many there are, with gender or sex, there's an infinite number of them apparently, then you need 6 dimensions before you're down to 1 in a billion. So 6 dimensions of intersectionality brings you down to the level of the individual, which is the flaw in, what would you call it, identity politics theory manifesting itself as an internal contradiction. So I think that's very funny. If you push intersectionality to its final frontier, you break down everyone to the level of the individual, which is actually what I think Western culture figured out about 4,000 years ago, is that the ultimate minority is the individual, and the fairest society is one where individuals are allowed to rise to the level of their ability, because what are you going to do? You're going to co-vary out all their differences? It's impossible. It's technically impossible. Given postmodern logic itself, there's an infinite number of ways to categorize a finite number of facts. So how are you going to determine which dimensions of difference are the ones that should be adjusted for the individual, since there's an unlimited number of dimensions of variability? Intelligence, height, attractiveness, age, personality. There's 5 dimensions of personality. Socioeconomic class, right? Degree of historical oppression. You know, that can be seriously multiplied endlessly. So what are you going to do? Control for all those? It's like, good luck. That's never going to happen. And then diversity in the service of what exactly? You know, the idea that a group of people that's racially diverse is better at problem solving than a group of people who isn't. There isn't a shred of evidence to support that idea. It's a presupposition, a supposition. And it also brings you back to something like racial essentialism, right? I mean, so in every possible way, logically and practically, it's a non-starter. And I think the diversity issue is irrelevant anyways, because I think the fundamental reason that the postmodern neo-Marxists push diversity is because it's another way that they can attack the power structure that they regard as patriarchal and oppressive. Say, well, it's in the service of the working class and the oppressed. It's like, we already covered that a little bit with regards to the Marxist claims to be working on the side of the working class, when in fact what really happened was that many of them, perhaps most, were killed. And the ones that weren't killed were certainly at least made extraordinarily miserable, which maybe is even better than killing them if you're particularly malevolent. Today, and see, one of the things that's happening that's quite pathological is, and very interesting, is that the postmodernists, and this is, I think, a direct consequence of training of activists in universities, and the universities have more to be ashamed of than you could list in a 2-hour lecture. I think someone estimated today that about 4,000 colleges and universities will go bankrupt in the US in the next 10 years, and as far as I'm concerned, the faster the better. So, the Toronto District School Board announced recently that it will now give priority to the hiring of diverse staff, especially in racialized backgrounds. Why in? I don't know. I suspect it's because the people who wrote the damn policy are functionally illiterate. But you'd certainly think that if you looked at the intelligence of their policies. And so, what's that? Priority to the hiring of diverse staff, especially in racialized backgrounds. What the hell did that mean? I tweeted that if you weren't going to hire straight, white, I guess cisgendered is the same thing, but we'll use it just because it's such a hateful phrase. If you're not going to hire straight, cisgendered men as teachers, why the hell do you let them into the faculties of education to begin with? You might as well just exclude them before they waste 4 years on your, what would you call them, ideologically rigid pseudo-educational nonsense. Equity, this is something I really like. There's the little happy thing. Equality of opportunity on the left versus equity on the right. You see, the little kid gets to lift up and eat the apple. Isn't that lovely? But what happens really in equity is that everyone gets to have exactly the same depth of grave. And they're perfectly equal when they're 6 feet under. And if you don't believe that, then you can look at what happened in the Ukraine in the 1930s during the Holodomor, when the Russians decided that, or the Soviets decided that it was perfectly reasonable to ascribe class guilt to the successful farmers and wipe them out, and then starved 6 million Ukrainians to death, thus establishing a certain equality. This woman, I remind this is the Shakespeare quote, I think it's from Richard III, but I'm not exactly sure. One can smile and smile and smile and still be a villain. And you know, she's a lovely looking old grandmotherly type of creature, but that doesn't mean that everything that she did wasn't pathological beyond belief. And it was her what would you call them, second-rate pseudo-intellectual opinionated meanderings that produced the concept of white privilege. And what she did was make a list of all the ways that she felt that she was particularly privileged in society. That was her bloody methodology. And that's the sort of methodology that these pseudo-disciplines that have invaded the universities get away with, because the rest of the faculty are too damn timid to stand up and say, the emperor has no clothes. You better stand up and say something about it pretty soon, because you can bloody well be sure that they're coming for the physicians and the evolutionary biologists and psychologists next. And they're not weak, and they're well organized, and so it's a very terrible thing. So anyways, these papers rely on personal examples, because we know how methodologically rigorous that is, of unearned advantage as but that whole methodology thing, that rigorous methodology, that's just another manifestation of the Eurocentric patriarchy. So you don't have to be concerned about your damn methodology when you have your personal experience to rely on. And so here's the privileges. I can, if I wish to, arrange to be in the company of people of my race most of the time. If I should need to move, I can be pretty sure of renting or purchasing housing in an area which I can afford and which I would want to live. I can be pretty sure that my neighbors in such a location will be neutral or pleasant to me, unless they know that I'm the author of the fundamental paper on white privilege. I can go shopping alone most of the time, pretty well assured that I will not be followed or harassed. It's like, well, the first thing is a lot of those so-called privileges are just the consequence of living in a reasonably civilized society and apply to pretty much everyone. And the second thing is that there's no reason to associate this with race. That's another one of these absolutely pathological sleights of hand. How about we call it majority privilege? You think that's not the case for the majority members of every society that's ever functioned, that's actually been functional? Obviously there's a majority advantage. If there wasn't a bloody majority advantage, people wouldn't make societies. The whole point of making a society is so that the people within the society have the advantages. So now you might say, well, when people are being integrated into the society, they should be given those advantages or provided with those advantages when they join the club, so to speak, as rapidly as possible. And obviously that's the case. But to attribute this level of civility and safety to some hypothetical construct like white privilege is, well, it's exactly what you'd expect from people whose response to the idea of methodology is that that's just a social construct like everything else is. There's the class enemies from the Ukraine, the kulaks, right? They were the farmers who were productive in the 1920s and before, had recently emerged from the peasant class. They were all rounded up and shot and raped and robbed and then sent to Siberia to freeze to death or to die of some infectious disease, because to them guilt was attributed as a consequence of their membership of a class. And I can tell you, if there are people around you that are attributing guilt to you because of your membership in a class, they are not your friends. In fact, they're the friends of no one, and they're contributing to this intense state of political polarization and racial disharmony that seems to be expanding at an exponential rate. It's not good. I really like this juxtaposition of pictures. So when the Soviets collectivized the farms in the Ukraine, they took all the grain that the Ukrainians had produced, which wasn't very much because they had collectivized the farms, and they shipped it all to the cities. And then the rule was that if you were a starving Ukrainian woman who had children and you went out in the field and you picked up individual half-rotten bits of grain to feed your kids, that was an offense punishable by death. You were supposed to turn that in to the local authorities so they could ship that to the city too. So on the one hand you have a nice picture here of the bags of grain that were heroically going into the cities, and on the other hand you have a picture of the bodies that were the cost of doing precisely that. So let's look at the failures of this system. Well, you could list them forever. The death of the kulaks, that was right off the bat, which is why I use it. It was very, very early in the collectivization process. Then the Ukrainian famine, which, I mean, I don't know how often that's taught in high schools in the United States and Canada, but I would suspect never is the answer to that. The rise of the Gulag state, because it turned out that the bloody Soviet Union couldn't function unless they enslaved everybody and made them work. The death of tens of millions, it's uncountable. The 56 crackdown on Hungary, the 68 invasion of Czechoslovakia, not to mention the whole Cold War that put the whole goddamn world at risk from 1962 to 1989, and that still is rearing its ugly head with our current dispute with North Korea, which is the last remaining, let's call it, Gulag-like Soviet state. So there's the death counts, perhaps. That's a relatively conservative estimate. 8 to 61 million in the Soviet Union. It's quite a margin of error, wouldn't you say? That's the Red Terror, the Great Purge, the national operations of the NKVD, later the KGB, the Great Purge in Mongolia, Soviet killings during World War II, the People's Republic of China, land reform. That's what you call it when you take land that grows food and turn it into land that's just full of corpses. That's land reform. And the suppression of counter-revolutionaries. The Great Leap Forward, that was a good one. The Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, Cambodia and the killing fields, and then a list of other countries. Every single place where these pathological ideas were put into practice became what you might describe as the literal equivalent of hell on earth so rapidly that it was a kind of miracle in and of itself. And yet we still, you know, what is it? 1 out of 5 social scientists in American universities regard themselves as Marxists. It's like, what the hell? Really? Really? What is going on with that? I don't understand that in the least. You know, I don't understand why that pathological ideology that's so murderous, so intensely murderous, and so closely tied to the genocides from a causal perspective cannot have accreted to it the same, what would you call, unutterable state that Nazism has accrued to itself. What's going on? Why don't we see it that way? I don't understand that. I mean, maybe it's because of the hypothetical universal utopia that the damn Soviets were aiming at. Maybe you could get away with that in 1895, you know, or maybe after World War I when things were brutal and the monarchies of Europe were collapsing and everything was chaotic. You didn't know that your utopian ideas were going to result in an absolute catastrophe, but it's 100 years after that now, almost to the day. And the evidence is clearly in. I'm a Marxist. It's no, you're just jealous because you don't make as much as a bloody investment banker. So that's why you're a bloody Marxist. If you were paid 4 times as much, you'd be a capitalist so fast it would make your head spin.